So, now that we've all agreed that the golden age of television is well and truly over, I think there's space to discuss some of its autopsy findings. The second golden age of television spanned from around the early 90s to the late 2010s, depending on your standards. I personally start the timer at Twin Peaks and ended around the Game of Thrones finale. I've made no secret of my admiration for animated kids television on this channel in the past, and one of the things I think people seriously discount when they talk about the second golden age of television is the role kids programming played in setting the tone, both for the programming possibilities in the cable era and the lives of millennials as a generation. It's crazy to look back now and realize how good we had it. You see, children, back before YouTube existed, you would come home from 4th grade and choose from a cornucopia of shows whose only commonality was that they all kind of felt like they were conceptualized after consuming 5 bowls of Reese's Puffs and some kind of experimental psychotropic drug. My personal lineup during elementary and middle school included Doug, Rugrats, Ren and Stimpy, Rocko's Modern Life, Real Monsters, The Angry Beavers, The Wild Thornberrys, Rocket Power, Kim Possible, SpongeBob, As Told by Ginger, Cat Dog, The Fairly Odd Parents, Invader Zim, Hey Arnold, Avatar, Courage the Cowardly Dog, The Proud Family, Dexter's Laboratory, Ed, Edd and Eddy, Pepper Ann, and the Powerpuff Girls, and I far from exhausted the options on offer. And looking back on these shows now from our current media wasteland, part of what interests me about them is how often they rely on horror techniques, sometimes just being horror shows straight up. Courage the Cowardly Dog, for example, is a genuinely scary show, and while it's probably the upper limit of the level of horror available to kids at the time, other shows of the same period often incorporate horror stories as a completely acceptable part of their narrative offerings. This is usually in the form of a Halloween special of some kind, where the horror story is taking the form of one of the most important folkloric structures of all time, the ghost story.
The sash ringing, the sound of the flash singing, the bash pinging,
the hat-slinging slasher!
Historically, ghost stories are the method by which the trauma of the adult world is introduced to younger generations. This is the sociological function they serve, but I think focusing too much on function can encourage us to discount the artistic qualities of the item itself, what a ghost story is as a literary object. And what a ghost story is as a literary object is cultural trauma transformed into play. That's crazy. Think of the transgressiveness inherent in the fact that woven into the very fabric of human communication is a narrative structure specifically for children that involves taking the worst things that can possibly happen to humans and using them as raw material to goof off. Ghost stories are a ritual, and the primary function of ritual is to perform a delineation for each other between acceptable and unacceptable, the sacred and profane. But this ritual in particular is so extremely interesting to me that I basically made a whole YouTube channel about it. Ghost stories, and their grown-up parallel horror stories, are the only ritual we conduct that by its own rules accepts a limit to how precisely we can either define the sacred or profane. Kids, who are still learning social mores and growing accustomed to the idea of death and trauma, are in a unique position to question what constitutes acceptability or transgression in society. Kids aren't just underdeveloped adults. They constitute a population of their own, with their own cultural experiences and ideas about the world. Here's how Nick executive Linda Semensky describes the Nickelodeon brand as it was developed in the 80s and 90s. The basic idea was that kids lived in a grown-up world, and that it was tough to be a kid when you had to follow all the grown-up rules. Either you were part of them, the authority, and expected kids to be quiet, behave, and follow the rules, or you could be a part of us, referring to kids, or in this case, Nickelodeon. The us believed that kids should be free to play around, have fun, and stand up for themselves. Nickelodeon positioned itself as understanding kids, being for kids, giving them what they wanted to see, and giving them a place where they could be kids. Nickelodeon discovered that, contrary to popular belief, kids did not want to grow up quickly, but instead wanted to enjoy being kids. So given all this, I think it makes sense that watching the animated Disney series The Owl House felt to me a lot like watching a 90s Nickelodeon show. The Owl House is a Disney Channel original show created by Dana Terrace. It follows a kid named Luce as she accidentally crosses into the Boiling Isles, a town built on top of the moldering skeleton of a gigantic monster in a Boschian demon realm from whence it's explained all our human horror stories and myths come from. Luce arrives in the Boiling Isles due to a mistake by a witch named Ida, who Luce pesters into teaching her magic because, as is natural for any weird kid being sent off to conformity summer camp, Luce is absolutely thrilled to be here.
Good morning, terrifying fantasy world!
Good morning!
Thematically, The Owl House is a story about questioning authority. It's a kid's show, but it's honest about the benefits and consequences that come from choosing to be a nonconformist and the occasions in which nonconformity becomes the only ethical choice. By the way, I am about to spoil this show like a Texas summer spoils milk in a broken fridge, so if you want to keep your knowledge of this obscure children's television show uncorrupted, proceed no further. The Boiling Isles is ruled over by an emperor who has imposed a system of controlled magic onto the citizens, forcing all witches to commit to a specialized coven, after which all use of non-coven specific magic is banned. Agreeing to be in a coven involves getting a sigil branded onto you that, unbeknownst to the witches, will eventually drain all their magic on the promised Day of Unity that's meant to open up some kind of witch utopia at the behest of the emperor. The emperor, in fact, is a human from witch hunting times who hates witches so much that he's taken it upon himself to rid the world of them forever by any means necessary, up to and including becoming a witch himself to do it. They fit a lot of lore into 2.5 seasons of this show. In a lot of ways, The Owl House is a sort of anti-Harry Potter, or rather, Harry Potter as it should have been. Like Harry Potter, there's a magic school that the audience stand-in is invited to regard as wondrous and amazing, and like Harry Potter, the magic school is structured into subdivisions, here in the form of magical disciplines that are meant to act as a sort of major for the future coven you're absolutely going to choose unless you want to spend your life running from the law.
According to the rules, a good witch needs to hocus focus. You can only pick one of the 9 tracks.
Unlike Harry Potter, the central conflict of the story actually investigates the logic of bigotry, rather than propping bigotry up as an arbitrary monster to slay. It's always been a weird aspect of Harry Potter that the threat Voldemort poses doesn't actually have much to do with the people fighting him. Like, it's very noble and good for wizards who don't have any direct personal stake in whether muggles are persecuted to fight against Voldemort, but in a way that I think a lot of modern critics after J.K. Rowling completely lost her shit have spoken to accurately, it seems like Harry Potter really is mostly about how we should best rule over the less merited. The central crisis in Harry Potter involves how closely wizards should associate with people who can't do magic.
Are those
Muggles in their rightful place.
Harry Potter is fiction. J.K. Rowling made it up, so I think the question of why she would invent her world as being one where some people are just naturally vastly more capable than others, and then try to turn it into a story of open-mindedness and generosity is reasonable. And I think the reasonable response to that question would be that her construction of the wizarding world is built to allow kids who don't really fit into broader society space to wonder whether there might be some alternative way of life that fits their richness of imagination. But the lesson of Harry Potter to kids who don't fit in has always had an aftertaste of ultimate superiority. Don't worry, kids, someday all these jocks will work for you. Which can't help but complicate its ability to be a force for social justice, I feel. Harry Potter runs on a similar kind of logic as a lot of civil rights movies, where helpless black people are saved by an idealized ally. Or like, imagine a story about women's suffrage that centers around a cast of men. That's you, Harry Potter. That's what you sound like. I still think there's a lot of charm in the world building of Harry Potter, but it really did paint itself into an uncomfortable corner. Because the story establishes itself around this found family metaphor, which by its nature requires exclusivity, it makes Harry Potter pretty ill-equipped to sell itself as an anti-bigotry story at the same time. The recent criticism that the government in Harry Potter is basically a neoliberal society uncritically accepted as natural is, I think, completely accurate. Nothing is really wrong with the system as is. We just need the right Minister of Magic in charge. By contrast, the system of leadership in the Owl House is fundamentally the problem because of who it excludes and why. Emperor Bellos is evil for sure, but even if he wasn't, the expectation imposed on the citizens of the Boiling Isles that they should let some of their skills and interests wither on the vine for the sake of community cooperation is basically logically indistinguishable from how modern capitalism functions under these shamefully basic interpretations of the wonders of comparative and absolute advantage. You know, Spain has wine, Portugal has fish, so they should each focus on their advantage and trade with each other to make up for their individual lack. It's a good enough guideline for international trade, I guess, but extending that understanding down to the individual and treating it like a matter of natural law, the way our mainstream consideration of economics does, results in a treatment of production, any kind of production, whether of goods, art, information, etc., as only being as valuable as what you can get for trading it. When Luce gets admitted to magic school, she is as overwhelmed by her desire to learn absolutely everything as she is bemused about why so many of her new classmates seem so bored by learning, or even worse, broken down by this grotesque framing of knowledge as only being useful or desirable for how it can be packaged and sold. In a world like that, where a very narrowly sanctioned version of excellence is what determines the amount of acceptance and respect you get, people who fail, whether due to lack of ability or lack of desire, are an inherent threat to the system, simply because they're living proof that the dominant ideology doesn't actually represent the interests of everyone in the community. This is how marginalization happens, the process by which some people arbitrarily come to be called stupid, crazy, dangerous, all three. This dynamic, the relationship between ability and disability as defined by the narrow confines of whatever the status quo happens to be, is central to the construction of character in this show. Luce can't do magic inherently, and the reason why is biological.
Now, humans think magic is made out of thin air, but that's stupid. Everything comes from something. Let me ask you, kid, where do you think magic comes from?
From the heart?
Actually, you're right. No, really. It comes from a sack of magic bile attached to a witch's heart.
Oh, gross!
But that doesn't automatically translate into an inherent separation between people who do and people who don't have access to magic, because as she finds out, magic in this world is actually pictographic. Witches who can do magic inherently just get to skip the part where you draw out a sigil to make something happen. So the problem of access to magic in the Owl House is not really biological, it's methodological.
But how can I, little old Luce, do magic if I don't have a magic bile sack?
You know, I'm not actually sure.
What?
I know witches did magic differently in the past, but I never bothered to figure out how.
Ida!
Basically, the metaphor here is that Luce has a learning disability. The direction the study of magic has taken in the Boiling Isles functions under a method of study that excludes Luce because people like Luce have simply never been a consideration for this society. Her approach to magic, therefore, looks clumsy and primitive, but also contains this massive breadth of knowledge that witches on the Boiling Isles have just never previously had to consider. Her presence there becomes something to celebrate for objectively, societally valuable reasons the Boiling Isles couldn't have predicted, not just tolerated for the sake of some abstract ideal of diversity or tolerance. The Owl House is a great show. So it was bizarre news, to say the least, when it was announced that the third season of The Owl House would be the last one, and that instead of the typical 20-plus episode season, it would consist of 3 extended episodes, which according to creator Dana Terrace was itself apparently a hard-won compromise so the show didn't just get beheaded at a cliffhanger. So why'd this happen? Why did Disney take a critically successful show with high ratings and a strong grassroots audience and do it this dirty? What could they possibly have had to gain? If you're familiar with The Owl House, you probably know that the folk wisdom is essentially that The Owl House was canceled for being too gay. And yet another departure from the Harry Potter standard, the gays in this show actively do gay things with neither apology nor explanation. So the speculation is essentially that Disney pushed the limits of what kind of representation was allowed in pop culture and then pulled back for political reasons. Usually explained as having to do with managing their relationship to conservatives, especially in Florida, where Disney's verbal opposition to the Don't Say Gay law was threatening their erstwhile friendly relationship with the Florida government. But that doesn't really track, at least not completely. According to Terrace, the decision to end the show was made before the first season had even finished airing in 2020, despite many people within the company advocating for the show in a very real way. In a Reddit AMA, Terrace had this to say about the situation. While we have had issues airing in a few countries and are just straight up banned in a few more, I'm not going to assume bad faith against the people I work with in LA. At the end of the day, there are a few business people who oversee what fits into the Disney brand, and one day one of those guys decided TOH didn't fit the brand. The story is serialized, barely compared to any average anime LMAO. Our audience skews older, and that just didn't fit this one guy's tastes. That's it. Ain't that wild? Really grinds my guts, boils my brain, kicks my shins, all the things. It sucks, but it is what it is. Don't get me wrong, I don't think Disney particularly likes queer people past whatever profit the company expects to wring out of them, but I think there's a more complicated story to tell here. A story about the direction American TV is going as a whole. And that's ultimately why I'm making this video. I think of the Owl House and its cancellation as a harbinger of things to come. A fragile little canary in a place neither it nor us was ever meant to be, where light and oxygen are scarce and which we won't stop digging farther into no matter how lifeless everything around us increasingly becomes. Back in the big three studio days of American TV, when 90% of the country was watching either ABC, NBC, or CBS at any given time, the expectations for what was possible to say on TV were probably best described by Paul Klein, who was head of NBC programming when he described his strategy of least objectionable programming in an issue of TV Guide in 1971. The idea goes like this. People living in post-war American society don't watch TV for the shows. The point of watching TV is not to engage with storytelling. The point is to have the TV on. Watching TV is an activity that transcends the content of anything that's actually on the TV. So, if you want to make a successful show, don't make a good show. Make instead a not bad show. A show that keeps your audience from embarking upon the series of minimal effort tasks that constitutes finding something else to watch. Never before or since in the history of mass communications has societal attention been so narrowly concentrated as on TV in the time period between the 50s and 80s. It's a great case study in the way oligopolies in the entertainment industry essentially incentivize mediocrity as a matter of cultural identity. The uniformity of post-war mass media functioned partially as cultural instruction. By choosing the least objectionable narratives to tell, TV was systematically reinscribing certain cultural standards through their business practices, informing Americans of the kind of behavior that was expected from them. These days we're dealing with a very different kind of oligopoly, a small group of massive tech companies all competing with each other to provide us the most convincing illusion of choice. Most people get their news online, and that news is invariably organized by algorithms that have no interest in actually informing users, and even worse, think they know what you want to see better than you do. That's why today I've partnered with Ground News. Ground News challenges these warped communication standards by gathering news stories from sources across the world and giving you some much-needed context, the factuality and bias of sources, and the ability to compare headlines all in one place. Let me show you how this works. Okay, so here we've got an overview of a Pew Research poll recently done about how US voters differ on culture war issues. We can see here that it's been covered by 16 sources with a relatively even split between left, right, and center. If you scroll down to the bias distribution, you can see how biased these sources tended to be. And if we look at the headlines under the Ground News summary of the story, we can look at the language being used to talk about this. Here's a couple of left-leaning sources that emphasize the sharp division between what they call gender issues or hot-button issues. And from the right, we've got quite a different tone here indeed, with sources framing this in terms of how much the left literally hates family. Love that. From Fox News, we've got Biden supporters view family, marriage as far less important to society than Trump voters, survey says. And here from Washington Stand, we've got just 19% of Biden supporters say marriage and childbearing should be a societal priority. Pretty interesting insight into how these sources sell these problems to their audience. But Ground News doesn't just live on the website. The browser plugin will give you information about news articles as you read them, with the Ground News bias analysis displayed at the top of your screen. And the mobile app gives you an intuitive, easy-to-manage version of Ground News on your phone, with notifications of breaking stories customized to your interests. Ground News is a tool I love using anytime I want more of a view from above of whatever news story I'm reading, which is always. And now, if you go to Ground News using the link in the description, ground.news/morbid Zoo, or scan the QR code on screen now, you'll get 40% off a Ground News Vantage subscription, giving you unlimited access to every feature to improve your information consumption habits. Thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. So what finally disrupted the mid-century TV network oligopoly was a series of dramatic technological and corporate events over the 80s and 90s. Fox Broadcasting Company begins competing with the big three. Mass market adoption of VCRs lets people record off the TV and watch stuff on their own time. And perhaps most importantly, Cable had been around for a while, but it didn't really become a main stage player in the TV market until HBO successfully advertised cable as a means of circumventing the lack of choice offered by the broadcasting system. HBO was for the discerning TV watcher, the sophisticate who saw TV watching as an active rather than passive activity. Of course, this is the broadest possible overview of the late 20th century TV market, but the point is that once more choice in TV became possible, TV was forced to contend with its own position in society and what that position meant both culturally and for their businesses. What followed in the wake of this new media landscape was the second golden age of television, and Nickelodeon was one of the first channels to brand themselves with the technique of narrowcasting to the specific societal niche of children, rather than broadcasting to what few commonalities might exist between every single person in the country. Disney, the eventual future owner of the Owl House, was at this point emerging from their own series of corporate political upheavals and competitions, which itself laid the conditions for what we now know as the Disney Renaissance, the period of time that produced many of Disney's most iconic movies. With the rise of cable, it was an intuitive move for Disney to invest in a TV channel of their own, especially given the runaway success of Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network. But Disney was a pre-established company, decades old and already a mainstay in the film industry with all the attendant government entanglements to match. Disney as a company has always associated itself favorably with American institutions up to and including acting as a literal American propaganda wing to larger or smaller extents since its founding.
All right, here he coming. Time to shooting now, please, I hope. No, wait, please. Japanese customs say always shooting a man in the back, please. Oh, thank you.
So contrary to the sort of baby punk vibes Nick pursued in its branding, the brand of Disney Channel is inextricably linked to a specific tradition of post-war American values, which manifests in the late 20th and early 20th century through promoting consumer citizenship as the proper American identity. Disney Channel's most popular original shows and movies that aren't Mickey Mouse universe tie-ins don't always, but often center around child characters who break expectations of how kids typically behave to accomplish things beyond their years while remaining comfortably inside the status quo.
Cost-to-value ratio aside, Kimmy, don't you already have a functional coat?
It's a good thing fashion sense isn't genetic. My jacket's from last season. It's red.
While Disney may consider social change desirable and may promote it, they only ever do so as long as that change can continue to encourage viewers to buy Disney products. As media and English professor Jennifer Gillen writes, whether theirs are social or entertainment needs, Walt Disney messaging tries to persuade viewers that it is the company that is best able to assist them, implying that individuals and communities should take responsibility for themselves and rely on outside help not from the government, but corporate, community, and sometimes Disney star friends.
Friends for Change is making a huge effort to change the planet. We're gonna do even more.
We're going to help you find ways to bring green into your own neighborhoods and schools.
This is the brand that the Owl House defies. Not because it has so many nice things to say about government, it doesn't, but because it is a celebration of weirdness for its own sake, which is difficult to market as a social and consumer good. I think this is what makes it feel more like a Nickelodeon show to me, because those shows really don't have much of a point outside examining what it's like to be a kid at the turn of the century, with an imagination and every possibility in front of you. But I certainly wouldn't extend that claim to say that just because the Owl House gives certain 90s Nickelodeon type vibes, it would have done well on the specific version of Nickelodeon I grew up with. This is important. The Owl House is not the same as a Fairly Odd Parents or a Wild Thornberrys, because unlike a lot of modern kids' movies and shows, it is not designed to primarily appeal to the nostalgia of people who were kids at the turn of the century. Part of what makes the Owl House good is that it is specific to the current generation. Like, let's consider the role horror as a genre is playing in this show. Dana Terrace is about my age. I imagine she also grew up watching shows like Courage and Real Monsters and Hey Arnold and SpongeBob, and the experience of watching those shows as a child is a lot different from what I assume producing those shows as adults was like. And I think good artists understand and accept that, whether what they're making is for kids or not. Art is a conversation device, and you can't have an authentic conversation with someone if you're constantly trying to predict and control the outcome of that conversation. There has to be room for the other person to reply, which in art often happens through interpretation and transformation by the next generation of artists and audiences. The kids' horror of the second golden age of television was straightforwardly horrific. From a narrative standpoint, they exposed kids of that era to a kind of weirdness that was pretty new to American kids' television, and which I think cultivated a kind of unforeseen affection for weirdness among kids, at least in me. Courage is sometimes scary, but it's still definitively a kids' show.
At least I got arms and legs. You don't even got a neck. Ha ha ha.
Get out of my face.
Make me.
And as an adult, I find myself taking a sort of third position outside the obvious options of scared and not scared when I think of those shows that I suppose I'd describe as a kind of thrilling curiosity, not only in what makes a story scary, but in what fear itself meant for my experience as an audience member. The Boiling Isles is objectively a frightening place. Many of its citizens are bizarre and horrifying in design. The plants are red, it rains scalding water.
We don't have weather. We have plagues, tornadoes, shale hail, rainbows.
It's like a rainbow, but looking at it turns you inside out.
But none of these things are a problem for Luce, because she's a modern kid who has different ideas than previous generations about what a threat actually is. Things that exist outside the natural order are certainly weird through Luce's perspective, but are very infrequently portrayed as threatening just because of what they look like or are capable of. A lot of the humor works specifically because of this. Hootie, the face of the Owl House, is adorably designed, and even though he's undoubtedly a friend and a valuable part of the team, it's implied that there's something about him that within the context of the world is extremely unsettling, and the humor comes from not really getting to know why.
Hootie, no touching. Please hurry. The more I look at him, the more uncomfortable I get.
On the other end of the spectrum, evil certainly exists in this show. It's just that evil isn't any more reflected by appearances or social status in the demon realm than it is in the human world. The parts of the Owl House where horror is genuinely horrific are indicated by their effects, not their aesthetic. Things aren't bad because they're ugly. They're bad because they deceive and hurt people. It's the kind of environment that I personally think is especially suited to good, authentic LGBT representations for kids in a society where, if we're being honest with ourselves, queerness still lives in this medium ground between culturally acceptable and unacceptable, a marker of weirdness to mainstream society, but the inherent worth and beauty of which snaps into place in an environment where everything is beautiful and weird. Those middle grounds are where horror thrives as a genre, where it really has something important to say, which I think explains something about why kids tend to be interested in horror in the form of ghost stories more than adults tend to be interested in horror in general. Kids have the immense privilege to be in one of the purest positions of genuine creation. They're the ones who get to receive culture from the previous generation and decide all over again what really is sacred and what really is profane. And that's why it sucks so hard that the traditional Disney brand doesn't really have a place for this kind of weirdness, because the unforeseen effects of play, which is what art is ultimately, are the ones that actually matter. Art doesn't exist to be pretty or monumental or preservationist. It exists to ask future generations a very specific question. Here's what we were. What are we now? I think if a ship of alien diplomats arrived on Earth and wrote up a template of the modern American human right now, just based on major studio offerings, they would produce a human that has been floating in a cultural void for the past several years. Sometime in the 2010s, I imagine these aliens might posit, cultural history ended. And from that point on, Americans desired nothing from their art but fond reminders of that primitive time when stories held meaning for us, before we turned our attention to more important matters, like how to get AI to understand how hands are built. And that's the point of the Disney brand. It's the point of any entity that suggests we can find all our salvation in the pursuit of simple consumption and the production of objects for others to consume. In a cultural environment devoted to affirming the simple virtue of buying stuff, themes surrounding any kind of nonconformity, like queerness, will always be first on the chopping block, because they imply that there's really nothing you need to change about yourself in order to deserve happiness and fulfillment.
This evil man has now ruined a generation of kids. Instead of telling them, you know, you're special, you're great, why didn't he just say, you know what, there's a lot of improvement. Keep working on yourself.
I grew up thinking that everything was an opportunity to justify existing. But there are people out there who won't make you feel worthless. You just have to let yourself meet them.
We have this idea, especially in America, that society always develops toward progress, that there's never anywhere to go but up. But after a couple decades of corporate media power having its feet held to the fire, the industry giants have effectively reconstituted themselves and returned to the standard of least objectionable programming, whatever will keep people from demanding something new. I don't know what to do about this. I don't know what to do about Pixar making nothing but retreads of Better Days, or of the weekly Nickelodeon lineup being basically nothing but reruns of SpongeBob and Paw Patrol with the occasional unholy resurrection of millennial favorites. I don't know what to do about the fact that the tech companies whose inventions used to force corporate power into defensive positions have granted studios the ability to construct a culture industry that can refuse to stake a creative claim of any kind. And in the case of the Owl House, reject creative claims that are laid wholesale at their feet, all because creativity is a risky investment. Because investigating what it means to be a human who didn't ask to be born and isn't sure what to do with this world could suggest to kids that failing to fit into the current system doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, but that there might be other systems to try, not all of which have the best interest of corporate conglomerations at heart. Why, after all, should we expect Disney to want to speak to the daily experiences of 2020's audiences rather than the projection of perfect consumer citizenship they think should be the human ideal? Doing that might imply that the joy of being a human doesn't come from a predestined path, but from open-endedness, from complication. And complication is something the market will not tolerate. Through a fortuitous loophole, I actually have two sponsors today. I'm extremely grateful to Ground News for partnering with me, and I am additionally grateful to patron JJ Jameson, who requested I watch The Owl House after signing up for my $50 Patreon tier a while back. I'm not doing any more direct patron requests after the stack I have is done. It turns out doing requests is really hard, and I'm extremely thankful to him for asking me to check out this show. I probably wouldn't have otherwise, and I'm so glad I did. The Owl House is a real gem, and I am as sad to see it gone as I am happy to have found it. I rely on Patreon a lot for the time and resources required to make these videos, so even though direct requests are over, if you want to support the channel, consider checking out my Patreon. I post videos and scripts in advance there. That's where you can get access to the channel Discord server. For certain tiers, I'll send you a book I like, and sometimes I'll post long-form, off-the-cuff movie reviews like I recently did for Civil War. Speaking of Civil War, that's what the next video will be about. Oh my god, I have so many thoughts about that movie, and I cannot wait to tell you about them in August. See you then.